In this lesson, we're going to review validation in a bit more detail. At this point, you should already know the basics of how to use the validator class, but chances are you're still doing a lot of that work directly from your controller, which really isn't the best idea. So we'll take a look at some of the ways that you might already be doing it, and then build a better solution. But as always, I'm starting from scratch, so I need something to work with. So let me go ahead and generate a resource real quick. I will generate a resource for, let's say it's a post, and that needs a title and some body. All right, so that's gone ahead and created the migration for me, everything we need there. Now I will go ahead and migrate the database. So now if I switch over to SQL Pro, you'll now see that we have a post table as well as, of course, the migrations table. All right, so that should be good for us to get started. And as always, because we use my generate package, a lot of the brunt of the work has been done for us, like setting up the controller and the views and the model. All of that's been done for us so that we can get going very quickly. All right, so I'm going to open up the controller, and we will open up the post controller. And let's say the form for creating a new post. Let's go ahead and return view, and I'll zoom in just a touch, make post.create. All right, that view should already be created for us when we ran the resource command. So now let's just put it all in line to save a bit of time. So we will say create a new post. And within here, I'm going to open up a new form, and the URL, or instead, let's do the route, so I can set a named route, will be post.store. All right, I'll go ahead and close the form, and then I will switch over to Blade syntax highlighting. All right, so now we need a title, and I'm going to be very quick about this. I'm not even going to worry about labels because we're not really concerned with this. We're here to focus on validation. So I'll say form text for the title, and then form a text area for the body, and then finally form submit. And what I'll probably need to do here, again, this is kind of a bad practice. At least I think it's a bad practice. But one nice thing about paragraphs is that it gives you some instant formatting. In real life, I would probably stick with a list, because if you think about it, you're presented with a list of inputs to fill out. But having said that, other people prefer divs, some even do tables. It's up to you, but like I said, it doesn't matter for this lesson at all. All right, so now we've set up our form. Let's go ahead and run the server and see how this looks. PHP artisan serve. And if I browse to post/create, yep, that's exactly what you'd expect. So now, if I view the source, because we set a named route, it is going to post to the post collection. And if we are following a RESTful pattern, this is exactly what we would expect. Good. So now if I go back to post controller, the store method is where you would traditionally perform your validation. So let's first go through the process of how you might normally be doing it, and then discuss how we can improve it somewhat. So chances are the first thing you do is you set up the validator. So you could say validation equals validator make. Next, we will grab the input from the form and then specify some rules. In this case, let's say the title is required and so is the body. So we're just going to hard code all of this in. Again, I consider this to be a bad practice, but plenty of people, especially for smaller projects, probably do something very much like this. So now we could say if validation passes, then you would go ahead and insert a new row into the post table. And here we can just use mass assignment because now Laravel helps us protect against any security vulnerabilities that might have existed in the past. So I will say input all, or why don't we store that within a variable? That way I don't have to double up. There we go. We run the validator. If it passes, then we are going to create a new row within the post table, and then we will redirect back to the post collection. So redirect to the route post.index, which will take us back to /posts. But otherwise, if it did not pass, then they did something wrong, in which case all we want to do is redirect back and then show them the input that they've already added and also display some errors. So we will return redirect back, and I want to make sure I send through the input. And if you're not familiar with this, with input is going to make sure that when you reload that form, any values that had already been filled out will still be maintained. And that way, if they forget to fill out one field, they don't have to refill out all of them again. We've all experienced that. It's irritating. In Laravel, it's a non-issue. Just make sure you redirect back with the input. And also, in this case, we know that there have been validation errors, so we want to make sure that we flash those to the session so that we can display them to the user with errors, and we'll send that through. And that's all it should take. So let's try this out now. If I reload the page, I'm going to enter my first post, some data here. I will click submit. And now, like I noted, we're going to get a mass assignment exception. This is how Laravel protects you against some security vulnerabilities. So this is not a tutorial on mass assignment. It's been in the news a lot in the last 6 months. But essentially, when you are accepting user input like an array and passing it through to a method like create, attackers could have the ability to edit any fields that they want. So now Laravel is protecting you against this. So here's how we can still allow for this clean syntax while still protecting against mass assignment vulnerabilities. I'm going to open up our post model, and now we will say protected, fillable. This is a key property, and we're going to make this equal to an array of all the fields that can be mass assigned. In this case, I'm okay with title and body. All right, I'll save it. And now one more time, let's try it again. My first post, enter some gibberish data. And if I click submit, it does redirect back to the post collection. We don't have any logic for that just yet, but we can see it has been redirected. And now if I check the database, I reload, and now you can see that has been added. So this time, let's try it again, but don't enter anything. I'll click submit. And now notice that it's reloading the page and it's happening very quickly, but we're not providing any feedback for the user. So that's the next thing that we need to fix. Within our view, I will say if errors any end if, and we'll begin by just saying h2 errors. So let's make sure this works, and then I will explain it a bit more. So I will click submit, and now notice that that does show up, but if we reload the form, it disappears. So the errors variable or object is going to be available on every page load. So you don't have to worry about doing anything like if is set errors. Whether or not you have errors or not, it's still going to be available to you in your views. So all we're doing here is saying if we have any errors, then we want to display them to the user. So if you want, you could put them, assuming this is a list item or something, you could display your errors here. Or if you want to display them all at the bottom, why don't we do something really quickly like implode errors all, something like that. However, we need some way to separate them. If I try to run it like it is, I click submit, that will be displayed, but we aren't separating them with anything. Well, the all method allows us to specify a format. So we'll just use the syntax right here. And now if I reload and I submit, we're specifying that we wanted the message to be placed within list items. Now the only remaining thing to do is to wrap it within an unordered list, and we have a nice way to present errors to the user. One more time, if I hit submit, now we have a list of errors. But now I'm thinking that this is something that would probably be useful in a lot of different instances. So why don't we instead save this to a partial? So let me cut this out, and instead I'm going to include partials, and maybe we will call this errors. Now I will go ahead and create that. Partials, errors.blade.php, and paste that in. All right, let's make sure that works still. Click submit, and we are still getting the same thing. Now, a quick note on partials. Notice this underscore here. This is sort of a convention that I've picked up from other frameworks. You certainly don't have to do it if you don't want to. You don't even need to call it partials. You can call it whatever you want. Just as a best practice, though, adopt some convention that you use. In this case, I precede my partials directory with an underscore, just for a little bit extra of a reminder that, hey, these aren't views that I would use in and of themselves. They're always going to be included into an existing view. But now, with relatively little effort at all, we have a simple form so that we can view errors if there are any, or we can add something to the database. Click submit. And now that gets added to the database. And if I reload, now you can see it show up. All right, so now we can actually get to the bulk of what I wanted to cover in this lesson. Notice here that we're doing a lot in our controller. And what I mean by that is, think about it, the controller is responsible for directing traffic, so to speak. But now it's taking care of validation as well. And it's also now responsible for not only specifying the rules, but running the validator. So even for a very small project like this, our store method is already a dozen lines long or so. Imagine when your projects get even larger. So why don't we instead abstract this away to a validation service? That sounds like a better idea to me. If I return the sidebar, let's add a new directory called services. Now you could place this within your models, but I think of them as services. We require a validation service. So we'll create a new folder called services. And next, I'm going to open up my composer.json file and make sure I add that to the autoloader. Just remember, if you add files, you need to composer dump autoload in this case. But anyhow, now I can add a new file for my validation. So we will store this within a validators folder. This is the folder for our services that are specifically validators. So validators, and let's just call it validator.php. This is going to be an abstract class. And now, why are we creating an abstract class? Well, think about it. You could have one class for a post validator, and that would be responsible for validating a single post. But as you can imagine, a lot of that logic for validating a post is going to be true for validating a comment or any other type of data in your application. So in those cases, why don't we instead create an abstract class that they can all extend? Now, we are naming it abstract because this isn't a class we would ever use on its own. It needs to be extended in order to function as we would expect. So the first thing is, within the constructor, I want to make sure that it accepts the attributes. In order to validate something, it needs to have the attributes, or what's ultimately going to be the fields for a new table row. So we'll go ahead and store that on the class. Protected attributes. Next, I'm going to add another method called passes, and this is going to actually perform the validation. So I will say validation equals validator. We're going to use the built-in validator facade, and we need to pass in the attributes as well as the rules. Now think about it though, we don't want to hard code rules directly into this class. We don't want anything like protected static rules. We don't want that at all. And that's because obviously for each different type or model, well, it's going to have its own set of rules. So the class that extends this validator will store that. I'll go ahead and assume that that's been added. Now we can say if validation passes, then I will simply return true. Or we can clean this up and just say return true. Otherwise, we want to make sure that we store the error messages and return false. So I will add another property for the errors. And then we will say this errors equals validation messages. And finally, return false. Now that we have our abstract validator, let's go ahead and add another one specifically for a post. So I will add this right here, post validator. And while I'm thinking about it, I'm going to go ahead and make this a capital V, even though it doesn't really matter. All right, so we have this new post validator. But before I continue on, very quickly I'm beginning to realize that if we have lots of different validation types, we could have a post validator, a comment validator, a user validator, all of these different things. Let's go ahead and namespace it to keep things clean. So I will namespace this under services validators. Next, I will do the same thing for my post validator. Class post validator, and it's going to extend our abstract class here. Now, really, this is almost more like an entity. This is just a simple object that we require that's going to store our rules. So for this model, we're going to say a title is required, and so is the body. But of course, for larger projects, you're going to have a lot more here. We're just keeping it very simple. At this point, we're ready to try it out and see if I made any mistakes. However, because I have added two new files, the post validator and the abstract validator, I want to composer dump autoload. Composer dump autoload. Now, if I go back to my post controller, let's see how we can clean this up. Rather than calling this manually, instead we're going to say validation equals a new instance of our services validators post validator. However, already I'm beginning to see this seems a little redundant, and this really just comes down to preference. When using namespaces, we have validators post validator, or we could also just do validators post. There's definitely pros and cons to both methods. In this case, though, I want to keep it pretty clean, so we're going to stick with that. So with that in mind, I'm going to switch this out for post, because it's already under the validator's namespace. Because I've changed that, I'll run dump autoload one more time. And now all I need to do is pass through the input. So I can get rid of this line, I can get rid of this line, and now let's walk through this to see what happens. All right, so when somebody submits a form, we're going to create a new instance of post. Now all that this class is going to do is declare some static rules. And I will also rename it while I'm thinking to just simple post to match the class name. Now this class extends from validator. So if we open this up, we can see, okay, on the constructor, all it's going to do is set the attributes. But now I'm starting to think, well, this is a little redundant because I bet many of the times I'm going to send through input all. It'll be a rarity when I actually send through different attributes. So with that in mind, why don't we use a sensible default here? Instead, I will say attributes equals null. And now I will say this attributes, we'll see, are there attributes? If so, just return that. Otherwise, let's go ahead and grab input all. Now we have a sensible default, but if you need to override it for a different purpose or for testing, you can still do that. And now we can clean this up even further by getting rid of this right here. Next, we're going to call the passes method. So if I return to the validator, this method is now going to run. We're going to perform our validation, grabbing the attributes, which are in this case just input all, and then we're going to compare them against the rules that we specified within the post validator. Now, if it passes validation, we're immediately going to return true. But if they don't, we're going to set this errors property equal to the error messages, and I'm going to return false. Alternatively, if you want, you could throw an exception. So that's all we're doing here. If validation passes, then we create the post, redirect to the post collection. Otherwise, we redirect back. All right, let's go ahead and try this out now and see if I made a mistake. PHP artisan serve. Once again, I will click submit and already made a mistake. So it seems that within validator line 16, I have an issue here. And just make sure whenever you're using namespacing here, if you're going to refer to a facade like this, make sure you precede it with a backslash so that we're referring to the global validator class rather than services validator, which is not what we want in this case. Next, while I'm thinking about it, if I come back to my post controller, we have to do this slightly differently. Remember, if the validation fails, we set the errors on an errors property. So let's make sure that if it does fail and we redirect back, we send through the errors. And in order to access that, I will make that public. Alternatively, we could use get errors, but this is fine for this case. Finally, if I come back, because we no longer have the input variable, I can just say input all. All right, let's go ahead and try this out now. One more time, I click submit. We get our errors. If I add some text, now that updates, good. And we will say my final post, enter some gibberish, click submit. And now if we did everything correctly, if I switch back and reload the page, you'll see my final post. So that'll finish us up for this lesson. I know we didn't save too many lines, but that's not the goal. The main goal is to make sure that we're not having one class do more than it should be. The controller shouldn't be responsible for all of these different things. It's just responsible for directing traffic. A post validator class should be responsible for validating a post. So all that we've done here is abstracted that away to allow for that. And now the advantage to this is anytime we need to edit how a post is validated, we don't have to hunt through a controller, maybe more than one controller. We simply go to our services validators post and we can update it right here. And that will be reflected anywhere in an application where a post is validated.